The chair they gave me was smaller than every other chair in the room. I noticed it the moment I walked in. It was not an accident. The chamber aboard the Aurelian Spire stretched so wide that I could not see the far wall clearly. The ceiling was a dome of pale violet crystal, and the light that filtered through it made everyone look like they were standing inside a slow sunrise. Dozens of alien delegations sat in elevated rings around a central dais, their seats carved from materials I could not name. Each delegation had a nameplate, a flag, an assigned aide, and a direct line to the translation network. I had a folding chair behind a transparent panel, a datapad, and an earpiece named Aria that ran on batteries I had packed myself. 60 years. That was how long humanity had been traveling between stars. 60 years since the first warp gate opened above Mars, and we stumbled, blinking and breathless, into a galaxy that had been busy without us for a very long time. 60 years of catching up, borrowing technology, learning new languages, and being told politely but firmly that we were not ready yet. Observer status, that was what we had earned. Not a seat, an alcove, a transparent box at the edge of the room where I could watch and listen and take notes, and speak only when spoken to, for exactly 90 seconds per session. I sat down. I smoothed my diplomatic coat. I placed my datapad on my knee and thought about the scar along my left collarbone from a piece of shrapnel I had never had properly removed, and I reminded myself that I had been in rooms that wanted me dead before. This one just had not decided yet. Aria whispered in my ear as the chamber filled. She named species I had studied but never seen in person. The Thurvac, reptilian and broad-shouldered, their amber eyes scanning every room for threats. The Miru Collective, each member physically small but seated in a cluster that gave them collective voting weight. The Orvathi, tall and silent, their skin shifting color with their mood, and at the center of everything, occupying a dais that rose slightly above all others, the Velhari. The Velhari were the reason this summit existed. They were the reason any interstellar summit existed. They had held the conclave together for 2,000 years. Their empire stretched across 40 star systems. Their queen was 4,000 years old. She walked in after everyone else was seated, and the entire room moved with her, the way water moves when something large passes through it. Her name was Cythereal Vel Arum. She was tall in the way that architecture is tall, and she wore a gown made of what I can only describe as solid light. Her face was almost human, but the proportions were too perfect to be accidental, too symmetrical to belong to anything that had ever been hungry or afraid. She looked like something that had never had a bad day in 4 millennia. She opened the conclave with a speech that lasted 37 minutes. I timed it. She spoke of the Velhari legacy, of the peace they had maintained, of the careful order that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart. She spoke of the new star cluster discovered 6 months ago, rich in fuel-grade minerals and habitable moons, and how the conclave would now determine its rightful distribution. Humanity was mentioned once, one sentence. She described us as the newly emerged Terran species, whose application for full membership remained under review. There was a pause after she said it, and from somewhere in the upper rings of the chamber, I heard a sound that Aria translated as laughter. I wrote one word on my datapad. Noted. During the first recess I stayed in my alcove. I ate the nutrition bar I had brought, because I did not recognize the food being offered. I looked at the photograph I kept in my inner pocket, a picture of my wife and our 2 children standing outside our house on a Tuesday afternoon, the light catching in my daughter's hair, my son squinting against the sun. I folded it back up and put it away. That was when she came to me. I did not expect it. Queens do not visit observer alcoves. It is not something that happens, but Cythereal Vel Arum walked across the floor of the chamber during recess, trailed by 2 aides who looked horrified by the destination, and she stopped outside the transparent panel and looked at me the way someone looks at a painting they cannot quite understand. She studied me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in perfect translated standard, that she had not spoken with a human before, up close. I told her I was glad to meet her. She asked what humanity intended to contribute to the conclave, what we offered, why we were here. I said, perspective. She smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and it did not reach her eyes at all. She told me that her palace had wine older than humanity's reach into the stars. She said it without malice, the same way you might note that a puppy is small. She asked, gently, as if genuinely curious, what a species that had existed on the interstellar stage for 60 years could possibly teach anyone in that room. Someone nearby laughed again. One of her aides translated it for a delegation on the far side of the chamber. More laughter. I looked at her. I held the silence for a moment, not because I was searching for words, but because I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people listen harder when you finally speak. I said, with respect, that she was asking the wrong question. She tilted her head. She was amused. A queen entertained by a curiosity. She asked me what the right question was. I sat back down. I picked up my datapad. The recess ended, and the session resumed, and I said nothing else. The second half of the morning session was when Ambassador Kron of the Thurvok made his formal challenge. He was a large being, physically imposing in the way that all Thurvok are, and he had a methodical quality to his speech that reminded me of a prosecutor. He argued that humanity's observer status should be suspended, that a species with 60 years of interstellar flight had no legitimate standing even to observe a negotiation of this magnitude. He had done his research. He presented data on human ship speeds, which were slower than average. He presented data on human territorial reach, which was modest. He presented data on human military engagements, which were limited in interstellar terms. He noted that we had no verified record of surviving a conflict with another spacefaring species. He concluded that our presence was, at best, symbolic, and at worst, a distraction. He was polite about it. That almost made it worse. Under conclave rules, the observer may speak once per session. 90 seconds. I stood up. The room went quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that forms when people expect something harmless. The kind of quiet that exists before a child recites something they rehearsed. I looked at the prepared diplomatic statement on my datapad. Then I set the datapad face down on the chair. I told them they had excellent data on us. I said I meant that sincerely. Then I said that data is a photograph, and a photograph does not show you what the person survived before the picture was taken. I asked Arya to push a file to the chamber's central display. Not weapon specs. Not territorial maps. A timeline. A single, vertical timeline that began over 10,000 years ago and ran to the present. I told them I was going to tell them something about my species, not to impress anyone, but because they had asked what we offered, and I believed in answering questions honestly. I said we went to war with each other before we had writing, before we had cities, before we had any concept of a nation, or a boundary, or a formal reason to fight. We fought because we were afraid. We fought because we were hungry. We fought because the group on the other side of the river was different from us, and difference, in those early years, felt like danger. I named some of what followed, not all of it. There was not enough time to name all of it. I mentioned the centuries of plague that moved through our populations like fire through dry grass, killing in some regions a third of everyone alive, and how we rebuilt every time. I mentioned the 2 global wars in the 20th century that together killed over 80 million people and left entire cities as dust. I mentioned the years when we held 70,000 nuclear weapons pointed at ourselves, our own cities in the crosshairs, and the whole world balanced on the decision of a handful of people who were all very tired and very frightened, and not entirely sure they were making the right choice. I said that at several points in our recorded history, humanity had come within moments of ending itself, not from outside, from within. The closest call I am aware of was 14 minutes, a missile warning that turned out to be an error. One man in a monitoring station who decided, against every protocol, that it did not feel right, and did not press the launch confirmation. His name was Stanislav Petrov. He died an ordinary death decades later. We almost never talked about him. We are bad, sometimes, at honoring the people who save us. I paused. 14 minutes, I said again. I wanted the room to sit with it. I said we had documented over 14,000 distinct armed conflicts in recorded history. Wars between nations, wars within nations, wars over water and food, and trade routes and ideas, and the names of gods, wars that lasted an afternoon, and wars that lasted 100 years. We had been, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily violent for an extraordinarily long time. And then I said the thing I had been building toward. I said we were here. We had not ended ourselves. Not from plague, not from nuclear exchange, not from climate collapse, not from the 3-decade resource siege of the 22nd century that had come closer than any external enemy ever had to breaking us permanently. We had come through all of it, not because we were especially wise or especially peaceful, but because something in us refused to stop. Because when the dust settled, we rebuilt. Every time, the same hands that had burned things down reached into the rubble and started stacking stones again. I said that we did not become a spacefaring civilization because it was simple. We became one because we had spent thousands of years learning, at enormous cost, how to survive ourselves. And the species that learns to survive itself learns something that no amount of uninterrupted peace can teach. It learns that it is worth surviving. I sat down. My 90 seconds were gone. The chamber was very quiet. Arya whispered in my ear that Ambassador Kron's biological readings, visible on the public health monitor all delegations used for accessibility, had gone flat. His crest, which normally shifted with his emotional state, was completely still. She said she did not have a reference for what that meant in Thervok physiology. I told her it probably meant he was thinking. Counselor Yeth, the small insectoid diplomat who had offered me something warm to drink on my first day aboard, and was the only being on the ship who had done so, turned in the direction of my alcove. I could not read the expression on a face built so differently from mine, but the gesture felt like acknowledgement. The session closed. The chamber began to empty. I stayed in my alcove and repacked my datapad and thought about nothing in particular, which is something I learned to do in the military when the alternative was thinking about too much. She came back. No aids this time. Cethariel Vel Arum walked across the chamber floor alone and stopped outside the transparent panel and looked at me without the performance she had worn during the recess. The amusement was gone. In its place was something I recognized because I had seen it on the faces of commanders who had just received information that changed their understanding of a situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, without any of the theatrical weight of the morning, how many wars I had survived. Not humanity, me, personally. I thought about it. I thought about 2 deployments in brushfire conflicts on colony worlds that nobody back home had heard of until they were already over. I thought about an evacuation detail on a station that was supposed to be abandoned and turned out not to be. I thought about the piece of shrapnel in my collarbone that Arya still reminded me to have removed. I told her personally, 3. As a species, we had stopped counting somewhere around 5,000. After that, the historians had started categorizing instead. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the Velhari had maintained peace for 2,000 years. I told her I knew. I told her that was genuinely extraordinary, and that I meant it without any irony at all. She looked at me in a way she had not looked at me before, not with warmth, exactly. Something more careful than that, a recalibration, the way a navigator recalculates after new information arrives. She said that they had never had to learn what we had learned. I told her I hoped they never would. She stood there for another moment. Then she turned and walked back across the chamber, and her aides fell into step behind her, and the doors opened and she was gone. 1 week later, I was in my assigned quarters on the Aurelian Spire, when Arya told me an official communication had arrived through the Conclave's diplomatic relay. I opened it expecting a scheduling update or a protocol reminder. It was a formal amendment to humanity's standing within the Conclave. Observer status had been elevated to Provisional Council voice. It was not full membership. It was not a seat in the upper rings. But it was a voice. A real one. No transparent panel, no 90-second limit. A chair at the table. The document said it was the first such elevation in 200 years. There was a second item attached to the official seal. It was small, written by hand in Velhari script, and Arya translated it quietly in my ear. It said that the Velhari had spent 2,000 years learning to maintain peace. It said that perhaps they should speak more with those who had learned it hardest. It was signed with 2 initials. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my inner pocket next to the photograph of my wife and children on a Tuesday afternoon, the light in my daughter's hair, my son squinting at the sun. I looked out the porthole at the stars and thought about Stanislav Petrov, who did not press a button in 1983 and saved everything and received very little credit for it, and about the 14,000 wars, and about all the hands that had reached into the rubble and started stacking stones. They had asked what we could offer. I had told them perspective. What I had meant was something harder to say cleanly. What I had meant was that we are the only species at that table who built a civilization out of the wreckage of almost losing one, over and over and over again, until we finally understood, in our bones, that it was worth keeping. That is not a weakness. That is the oldest kind of strength there is.